Reagan has taken the Florida. I'm sorry, we apparently seem to have a little bit of difficulty maybe in telling time. I gather some stations have just joined us, so let me start all over again, and please be patient with us. We have already projected Indiana for Reagan. We have projected Georgia for President Carter. No surprise either there. But the most significant news thus far on this election night, ABC News is now able to project a victory in Florida for Governor Ronald Reagan, the Republican candidate. With only 1% of the precincts reporting in, nevertheless, the returns from our key precincts indicate that Governor Reagan will take the state of Florida. This is the first break in the solid South that President Carter had going for him in 1976 that was so responsible for his victory in 76. And even if Reagan does not beat Carter in other southern states, winning Florida puts him in very good shape for a showdown in the major northern states. So that is the major thing right now. Let's look at our national vote totals, if we can, at this point. While the returns are still quite early, we'll be able to show you that, I'll turn around and look at them here, with only 2% of the precincts in. Governor Reagan is running at about 53% to 42% for President Carter. But the major news of the night thus far is that President Carter, according to ABC News, will not retain the 17 Electoral College votes from the state of Florida. As I said, we've already projected Indiana for Reagan and Georgia for Carter. Ted?
Well, while you're on Georgia, Frank, let me give you some sense of what's happening in Georgia. No great surprise there on the Senate side either. Herman Talmadge, who was facing a reasonably rough campaign from Mac Mattingly, not a particularly tough one, though. Tougher this time only because Talmadge, as you may remember, was denounced by the Senate Ethics Committee for financial improprieties that had been committed during his last senatorial campaign 6 years ago. So there was some sense that Talmadge could be in trouble. Not enough trouble, though, to take that seat away from him. Herman Talmadge has maintained his seat in the U.S. Senate. Let's go now to Lynn Scher, who has some more information on exit polls. Lynn?
Ted, one of the things that President Carter was counting on was a rather large women's vote. That was supposed to be because women are considered more dovish than men, and the Democrats were hoping that that would therefore be to their advantage. But it turns out that as far as we can tell so far, it isn't happening. Let's take a look at the women's vote overall right now. It appears to us as if President Carter is not winning the women's vote, as he is not overall. Apparently, we do not have our graphics prepared yet for that, but let me tell you about it. The women's vote at the moment appears to be going 50%, half of it for Governor Reagan, and 40% for Mr. Carter. And with 8% for John Anderson, there you can see it. You can tell that Governor Reagan is winning it, President Carter not doing all that well. Now, just for your information, that's not all that different from the way the men's vote is breaking down. So we should point out that while some women did say that oh, there's our male voters board. Let's tell you about that. President Carter getting 34% of the men's vote, Governor Reagan getting 55%, and John Anderson 9%. Again, pretty close to the way it was before. So, as we say, there is no so-called women's vote, at least not on that issue so far in this election. That's something President Carter was hoping he would get. Frank?
Thank you, Lynn. Let's briefly review where we stand at this point on election night with another look at our national vote totals. With only 2% in, it's 53% to 42%. Governor Reagan leading President Carter at this point. The victory for Governor Reagan in the state of Florida, however, as projected by ABC News, is quite significant because it indicates that he was probably not hurt by one of the key issues that President Carter raised against him, namely worries that Governor Reagan's election might in some way jeopardize the Social Security system, which is a very important issue in the state of Florida. Well, we'll have more on the 80 vote right after this. The polls have just closed in North Carolina, Ohio, and West Virginia, so we'll be expecting some returns from those states momentarily. Before I go any further, Ted, I understand you have a projection on the Senate.
Yes, we do. In fact, Jim Betts was the unfortunate man who had to run against the former astronaut and the two-term senator from Ohio, John Glenn. ABC News is now able to project that John Glenn will be the winner in Ohio, holding on to his Senate seat there. So that's Glenn over Jim Betts. In fact, Jim Betts, the Republican Party had trouble finding anyone to run against John Glenn, and they finally found Mr. Betts, who was willing to do battle. It wasn't good enough. We are going to have some projections now on some early House races in Washington. Here's Britt Hume.
Ted, the Republicans are expected to gain ground in the House tonight, but not nearly enough to get control of the House. However, a number of House leaders are in very tough races for re-election, including House Majority Whip John Bradamus out in Indiana, a state which you gentlemen have already projected for Ronald Reagan a winner, and for Bradamus' Senate colleague Birch Bayh a loser. And it appears that Mr. Bradamus was in very severe trouble out there tonight and in a very close race indeed. On the Republican side, all the official leaders appear to be in good shape, but the unofficial conservative floor leader, Robert Bauman of Maryland, is in very serious trouble. That's the result of his being placed on probation in a case involving an allegation of homosexual solicitation. Tonight we will also see the result of one of the most interesting spectacles of the current campaign, and that's been the sight of a number of House members running hard for re-election while facing criminal charges as a result of the FBI's abscam operation. There is nothing like an indictment to stiffen a politician's resolve. All the congressmen indicted and even a couple convicted in the abscam investigation have stayed in the race for re-election. Richard Kelly, the only Republican of the lot, lost his primary. His Florida constituents apparently unconvinced by his extraordinary public claim that he was conducting his own investigation when he took the FBI bribe money and stuffed it in his pockets. He will be tried later. South Carolina's John Jenrette cited drunkenness as a defense at his trial and was convicted of taking a $50,000 bribe. But he's very much in the race for re-election.
The people of this district would not allow a bureaucrat in the Justice Department to tell them who was going to represent them in Congress.
Philadelphia's Ozzie Myers, who was not only convicted of bribery but kicked out of the House, is in re-election trouble. Videotapes of his bribe have been shown on TV. Myers also claims he was drunk at the time, full of FBI bourbon, he said. Across town, Myers' colleague Ray Lederer faces a similar $50,000 bribe charge, but has not been tried and has had a much easier time in his re-election bid. He's favored. Up in New Jersey, Frank Thompson, chairman of the House Administration Committee, and a man with many friends in Congress, is in a close race only because of the bribery charge pending against him.
It's got to hurt some. I don't think there's any question about that. But I don't think it's going to hurt so much that I'm not going to win.
Finally, on Staten Island, New York, John Murphy, the sleek chairman of the House Merchant Marine Committee, has taken the offensive in the bribery case against him, unsuccessfully demanding immediate release of the FBI tapes and denouncing the government for entrapment. It's close, but Murphy's expected to win his race. It is a paradox of American politics that the public tends to hold Congress in low esteem, but to exempt their own individual congressmen from that judgment. The abscam defendants would seem to be giving that principle a stiff test tonight. Frank?
Thank you, Brett. We'll keep track of all the abscam types as we go on through the evening. ABC News has projected now in the presidential contest Indiana and Florida for Reagan and Georgia for President Carter. We're waiting for returns from Kentucky, where the race there is too close to call. The polls have just closed in Ohio and a number of other states, and we'll be right on top of that, too. Well, it is November 4th, and what happened on November 4th, 1979? Everybody knows. The situation is still the same, although, of course, there is renewed hope now, particularly in the last couple of days. Barbara Walters is waiting to talk with a distinguished woman who, much against her will, I suspect, has become a public figure in this last year. Mrs. Kennedy, Barbara?
Thank you, Frank. This is Louisa Kennedy, Mrs. Moorhead Kennedy, Jr., whose husband is one of the hostages in Iran. Mrs. Kennedy has not heard from him since last August, and this is a grim anniversary to be celebrating, or celebrating is the wrong word, to be commemorating, I guess. But I must ask you, with all of the ups and downs and everything you've been through, what are your feelings tonight?
Very expectant. I think I'm talking about two things. First of all, the elections tonight, which we have finally gotten to here, and which spell something of such importance for the next 4 years for the United States. At the same time, this week certainly has offered us some positive signs coming from Tehran. And although it hasn't cracked as of today, it does look as if it will very soon.
I heard that it's your husband's birthday tomorrow.
That's correct.
What birthday is that?
His 50th.
You know, you and I first talked, I remember, just before Christmas, and you had the Christmas decorations up, and you hoped that he was coming home then, and you're a very strong woman. We've gotten to know each other over this past year. But how do you keep it all together? You know, when each week brings good news, then bad news, and...
Well, Barbara, I take it on a day-to-day basis. And there's been a great deal to do, you know, for the hostage families on this side. I think we feel as if we're fighting a little war here. Our weapons are perhaps words, but we have a side to keep up in this.
Do you think that President Carter has done the right thing?
Yes, I do. I feel that very fundamentally he has. He's handled this with great sensitivity.
We'll have perhaps a chance to talk a little bit later, but you know that our thoughts are with you tonight and every day until your husband is home with you. Frank has some more projections for us. We'll go back to you now, Frank.
Yes, thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Mrs. Kennedy. We're all looking forward to the day when we can see them all come back home. We have two very important projections for you now. First of all, from the state of Kentucky, ABC News projects that Ronald Reagan will be the winner of Kentucky's 9 electoral college votes. It's close, but that is a reversal of what happened in 1976. Reagan has now taken 2 southern states that were captured by President Carter in '76. It's close in Kentucky, but ABC News projects that he will win it. And ABC News also projects that Governor Ronald Reagan will be the winner of Virginia's 12 electoral college votes. In 1976, Virginia went for President Ford. It was the only southern state outside of Oklahoma that went Republican in '76. Virginia has stayed in the Republican column. Here is our map now, our color-coded map. As you can see, red stands for Reagan and blue for President Carter. The only state that we've projected for the president thus far is his native state of Georgia. The two most significant, here is the electoral college vote total right now. If we can whomp it up somewhere here, 270 votes are required. Governor Reagan, with his victories in the states we've mentioned, has 51, and President Carter has 12 from the state of Georgia. John Anderson has yet to achieve victory in any one state. Well, Barbara was talking with Mrs. Kennedy about the hostages. The hostage issue naturally became an issue, or at least a subject of discussion throughout this long campaign. And Lynn Scher has been keeping track of the ramifications of that during our exit polling today. So, Lynn, what have we learned?
Frank, as you know, the Iran hostage situation seemed to help Jimmy Carter in the beginning. It helped his standing in the polls. However, towards the end of the primary season, by the California primary, it turned out that it was hurting him, and that is true today, too. The importance of Mr. Carter's handling of the hostage issue, it seemed important to only 15% of the Carter voters, but it seemed more important to 32% of the Reagan voters and 22% of the Anderson voters. We should point out that those Reagan voters overwhelmingly, the ones who felt that it was important, of course, they were overwhelmingly for Governor Reagan on that issue. If we look at it another way, we can tell you that the hostage situation was important to about 1/4 of the voters today, and again, overwhelmingly, they voted for Governor Reagan. So, among Reagan voters, the hostage situation terribly important and hurting President Carter this evening. Frank?
Thank you, Lynn. Once again, 3 out of 4 southern states thus far have given their electoral college votes, according to ABC News, to Governor Reagan. Kentucky, Florida, and Virginia. Let's look at the national vote total. You see it here behind us with 3% in. Governor, oh, you're right. You're fine, Ted. We can see you. Governor Reagan with 53%, President Carter with 43%, and Congressman John Anderson running at 4%. It should be pointed out that Congressman Anderson's 4% is not really representative of what we might expect later on, because the returns thus far have not come from states where Congressman Anderson is expected to show strength. We'll have more on the 80 vote right after this. We note now that the 1 million vote mark has been passed for the first time tonight. Governor Ronald Reagan now has 1,186,000 votes to 967,000 for President Carter, who very shortly, too, will go over that 1 million mark. Any idea how many will be cast tonight? There's really conflicting reports about whether the voter turnout was heavy or light today. We'll have to wait and find out when all the polls are closed. Now we have another important race to report on the gubernatorial level. Max?
Frank, ABC News is now able to project that incumbent Democrat James Hunt in North Carolina is the winner of that race. James Hunt, powerful and popular governor of that state. in his race against State Senator I. Beverly Lake, who changed his party affiliation to run against Hunt with the backing of conservative Republican Senator Jesse Helms. Many feel that Hunt, who will serve another 4 years and will not be able to succeed himself, will run against Jesse Helms 4 years from now when Jesse Helms' Senate seat is up, and they figure that at that point the two most powerful political forces in the state will collide. Frank?
Thank you, Max. If you saw the evening news broadcast tonight, you saw an emotional moment when President Carter was addressing the townspeople in Plains and talking to them about how he fought to keep his commitment to them and to uphold the honor and integrity of the country. Well, thus far, it must be said, the news tonight is not encouraging for the president. We want to go to the White House now, to our correspondent who logged more than 6,000 miles traveling with Mr. Carter yesterday. We want to congratulate him, first of all, on being able to stand up. Sam Donaldson.
Well, Frank, the mood here at the White House is one of resignation tinged with serenity, interestingly enough. No one seems to be bitter. No one seems to be angry. But there is a deep understanding here of what has happened to President Carter today. As I reported on the evening news before the polls opened this morning, Mr. Carter's pollster, Pat Caddell, had told campaign officials that the numbers were not there for him and that he was not going to win this election. And so Mr. Carter, I thought, carried it off rather well this morning in Plains. He voted, and he came out of the voting booth, and we all asked him who he'd voted for. Well, he said he'd voted for himself, the best man. And I asked him, what would you do, Mr. President, if you lose? And he said, well, I'll abide by the judgment of the American people. I said, no, I mean, what are your plans? And he said, oh, well, I don't intend to lose. He knew at that time that the numbers weren't there. And then, as you point out, he went down to the train station, and it was reminiscent of that glorious morning 4 years and 1 day ago when he had won the election narrowly, and he was there in the street with his wife, and was another emotional moment as he talked about a new day dawning. This morning, he talked about hoping that he had kept a commitment to his townspeople and his fellow Georgians and to the country, hoped that he had been worthy of their having sent him to Washington to be president. And he choked up and finally got through it and said, God bless you. So Mr. Carter is here in the White House tonight. At some point this evening, he will go to a local hotel where a celebration is planned, but of course it will not be a celebration. He will make a statement, and then he will retire. And I'm certain in his own mind he will have felt that he had done his best and that he would have had no regrets about the campaign or about his presidency. Gentlemen?
Well, it is, of course, much too early for anyone to make any firm projection. Most of the nation, the polls are still open, and we are not in the business of making projections yet on who is winning the presidential race. It has been projected in a number of states, and Frank, I think you'll agree, particularly in states like Florida,
yes,
and Kentucky, that is not good news for President Carter, and it certainly doesn't look as though Mr. Carter is going to be able to hold on to the presidency. One of the big questions is going to be how much of a margin, if in fact Ronald Reagan wins, by how much of a margin, and how many Republican senators he can bring with him. Let's take a quick look at some of the Senate races that we have called already. Not too surprisingly, Herman Talmadge in Georgia over Mac Mattingly, Wendell Ford in Kentucky over Mary Louise Faust, John Glenn in Ohio over Jim Betts, and Fritz Hollings in South Carolina over Marshall Mays. The big surprise, not the big surprise because he had been targeted heavily by conservative groups, but the big changeover, a Democratic seat, Birch Bayh's seat in Indiana, has now gone over to Dan Quayle, the 33-year-old congressman. So there's the first change. There may be others as the evening progresses. Frank?
Thank you, Ted. The vote totals, the national popular vote totals at this point, with, let's see, 3% of the precincts reporting in, 52% for Governor Reagan, 43% for President Carter, and 4% for John Anderson. Our Electoral College election night map shows red for Reagan and blue for President Carter. The only blue state you see there is Georgia. That's those Electoral College votes have gone to him. That's the national election picture at 52 minutes after the hour.
This is an ABC News Special. The 80 Vote, Election Night. The campaign is over. The votes being cast and counted. Now the results from the nation and what they mean. Reported from the ABC News Election Center in New York by Max Robinson, Barbara Walters, and special analysis and commentary by national columnist Tom Wicker and George Will, moderated by Robert McNeil. And at the ABC News Election Night Anchor Desk, Ted Koppel and Frank Reynolds.
And good evening once again. While we were away, an immensely important state was projected by ABC News. Ohio, with its 25 electoral college votes, will go for Governor Ronald Reagan, the Republican candidate. This is a reversal. President Carter won Ohio very narrowly in 1976, and Ohio's 25 votes were crucial to his victory because he won by only 27. But we have projected now that Governor Ronald Reagan will take Ohio. And we have another projection. This one is not a surprise. West Virginia will go for President Carter, according to ABC News, on the basis of returns from our key precincts. 6 electoral college votes. President Carter winning West Virginia by a comfortable margin. See if I have, it's comfortable also for Reagan in Ohio. Let's have a quick look at our map now to show you just exactly how it stacks up at this stage of the election night. Red for Reagan and blue for President Carter. Reagan has won 5 states with a total of 76 electoral college votes, and President Carter has won 2, West Virginia and Georgia, for 18. The map does not actually show the electoral college votes, but that's the setup as of right now. 76 for Reagan and 18 for President Carter, with 270 needed. So Reagan has taken Ohio, Carter has taken West Virginia. That's the latest news. Now to find out what happened in Ohio and just why the people there reversed their decision of 1976, we go again to Lynn Scherr. Lynn?
Yeah, Frank, what we're beginning to see in Ohio as elsewhere is a pattern that we first spotted earlier this evening on a nationwide basis. In Ohio, as throughout the nation, in 1976, Jimmy Carter did very well and won, of course, very big, those Democratic groups, Catholics, blue-collar union, all those sorts of groups. This year, even though he is winning a lot of them, he is not winning them by the margins he needs. Ronald Reagan is cutting into those margins. Let's take a look now specifically in Ohio at the union vote. This year, Jimmy Carter getting 49% of that vote, Ronald Reagan 42%, John Anderson 7%, and if you look at that 49% figure, in 1976, Jimmy Carter won 53% of the union vote in Ohio. Now when we look at the blue-collar vote, this year, Jimmy Carter is getting 48% of the blue-collar vote, Ronald Reagan 40%, John Anderson 10%. Again, look at that 48% number. In 1976, Jimmy Carter got 59% of the blue-collar vote in Ohio. One more very traditional Democratic area, the Catholic vote. This year, Jimmy Carter getting 46% of the Catholic vote, Reagan 40%, and Anderson 11%. So, once again, we are seeing this pattern being repeated in Ohio as throughout the country. President Carter simply not holding on to those big margins in those Democratic areas. Ted?
Thank you, Lynn. One of the interesting things that we're going to be watching throughout this evening is the progress that outfits like Moral Majority or NICPAC have been able to make in terms of knocking off some of the candidates, particularly liberal Democratic candidates, that they want to extinguish politically. Frank, before we go into that a little further, though, I understand you have a projection.
Yes, but it's not exactly a surprise, Ted. The District of Columbia will give its 3 electoral college votes to President Carter. That was expected. Our term for the margin of victory, landslide. That is the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., going for President Carter. Ted?
All right, back on the theme of some of these conservative groups that have been trying to knock off some liberal candidates, their first success of the night appears to have been Birch Bayh in Indiana. When I say appears to have been, he has lost in Indiana. Whether or not the conservatives were responsible for that, no one knows. But if anyone has an insight into the campaign there and Birch Bayh's years in the Senate, it is our Senate correspondent, Cassie Mackin. Cassie?
Yes, Ted. Bayh was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and through his 3 terms in the Senate, he had worked his way all the way up to second-ranking member on the Senate Judiciary Committee. That, of course, is the committee chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy. But Bayh was also chairman of the subcommittee on the Constitution, and as chairman of that subcommittee, he shepherded through the Congress the constitutional amendments on the 18-year-old vote, on presidential succession, and on the Equal Rights Amendment. So the man has quite a distinguished record in the United States Senate. He is a reliable, liberal to middle-of-the-road senator. He is well-liked, well-respected by his colleagues, and there is no question that his leaving here will leave a big empty space among his fellow Democrats.
Thank you, Cassie. We'll have more on the 80 vote right after this.
Another projection now by ABC News. This, our first from New England, but from a state that is not exactly a stranger to politics. New Hampshire will give its 4 electoral college votes to Ronald Reagan, the Republican candidate. It's always ironic how hard the Democrats work up there to win the New Hampshire primary, and then New Hampshire forgets about them, and they forget about New Hampshire. You notice that the size of the vote was very, very small there, but we do this on the basis of our key precincts that are reported in, and also, of course, with the great help of the League of Women Voters, who phone in the results from these key precincts. We're very grateful to them for their cooperation, and we want to thank them not only now, but many times through this evening for volunteering their effort. Ted, you have a Senate projection.
I do indeed. No great surprise there. A wide margin. Robert Dole of Kansas, the Republican, has defeated his Democratic opponent. His opponent, John Simpson, was in fact himself a Republican until he switched parties for the sake of running against Bob Dole. So Bob Dole is the winner again by a wide margin in Kansas. Let's go now to Jim Wooten.
Frank, I'm here with Chairman William Brock of the Republican National Committee. It's a different sort of evening tonight for you than it was 4 years ago. You're winning in Ohio. We projected you to win in Florida. You must feel pretty good about how things are going right now.
I feel fantastic. We're going to have I think, an incredible win for Governor Reagan, which was well-deserved, and I think a party-wide win all the way down to the legislative level, and that's the fun of it. It's going to be a good night.
Now, we're getting reports that there was heavy turnout in a great many of these states in which Governor Reagan seems to be doing really very well. That goes against the conventional wisdom that heavy turnouts help Democrats. Is the conventional wisdom dead this time?
Yeah, because people, when they get mad and they get hurt, as they have been by unemployment, by inflation, they're going to vote for a change. And the way to do that, and that's been our message all year, to vote Republican for a change. And I think that's exactly what we've seen. I had hoped very much for a large turnout because we thought this was what would happen.
Well, now, you're talking about specific issues that have worked against President Carter, obviously inflation and unemployment, the entire economic scene. Is there a sense in the Republican executive ranks, at least the strategists and the wise men of your party, that this is actually a realignment, that there is a major realignment going on here?
We've been trying for it for 4 years. We're getting very strong support, as you've noticed, from the Catholic community, not a traditional Republican community, from blue-collar workers, from union members. We're getting 25% of the Democrats in this country so far. Now, what that does is it gives you a chance to build a coalition, and it is through coalition that you govern and govern effectively. And I think that's one of the more important things that's happening in this election, because it does argue for a very strong administration, and that's what we need.
Are you persuaded that voters, Democrats, for instance, who went more to Reagan this time than they did to Carter, are they dissatisfied with Carter or more attracted to Reagan? What's your instinct on that?
Yes. Well, what we've tried to do in arguing for a vote up and down the whole ticket this year is to say that the Democrats have been in power now for 25 consecutive years in the Congress. It isn't just in the White House that we need to make changes. And I think voters have decided that perhaps we really need a lot of new faces in politics, better faces, people that are newly elected, because that means they'll pay more attention to the average voter.
Thank you, Chairman Brock. Frank?
Bill Brock, the Republican National Chairman, who lost his seat 4 years ago to Senator Sasser in a Carter sweep of the state of Tennessee. Well, if you were watching that interview as well as listening to it, you saw that ABC News has now projected Kansas electoral college votes, 7 in all, will go to Governor Ronald Reagan. So ABC News now has projected Governor Reagan the winner in 7 states with a total of 87 electoral college votes. President Carter in 2 states and the District of Columbia with a total of 21 electoral college votes. If they're not breaking out the champagne at the Reagan headquarters now, it's only because they can't find an opener. Barbara is waiting now. She's just had a conversation with an insider in the Carter campaign. Barbara?
Yes, he is an insider, Frank. We just talked with Pat Caddell, who is President Carter's chief pollster and a good friend of the president. And he did say that last night he told President Carter that he was going to lose. I asked how the president took it. He said he took it well. And I said, well, then you mean, Pat, that you don't think that you have a chance? He said, well, all you have to do is look up at the boards and you can see it's spelled out. He said that as of Saturday, it seemed to them that the situation was relatively even, and then things changed over the weekend. the hostage situation worked against President Carter. And when I said, well, was it because voters thought that it was a political move, he said, no, not that it was political. No, that wasn't it. He said they would have a fuller explanation later. But they watched things over the weekend. They saw that it was going downhill for the president. And last night, his friend and pollster said, you're not going to make it. Right now, he said President and Mrs. Carter are in the residence with the family, and nobody's feeling very good, but they all seem to be reacting rather courageously and calmly. Frank?
Well, as Sam Donaldson mentioned earlier, you know, Barbara, there's a certain serenity around the White House tonight. After all, there is the realization nothing more can be done. Decision is in the hands of the voters. Certainly, the president fought as hard as he could to win this. Here is another projection that is bad news for Mr. Carter. ABC News now projects Ronald Reagan will win the 17 Electoral College votes of the state of New Jersey. New Jersey for Ronald Reagan. We don't have any votes on the board yet, but the returns from our key precincts indicate that Ronald Reagan will win New Jersey's 17 Electoral College votes, just as President Ford did in 1976. Well, now, all right, I was just about to go somewhere else, but I'm going to go right over here to you, Ted.
Well, we go to neighboring, from New Jersey, we go to neighboring Connecticut, where Christopher Dodd, who is the son of Thomas Dodd, who was at one point the senator from Connecticut. Christopher Dodd is making it a family tradition. He has beaten James Buckley, the Republican. So we have something interesting happening here, Frank, in the sense that it appears to be going against the presidential grain. It doesn't seem to matter what Mr. Carter is doing in terms of helping anyone. You have to have a very strong lead to overcome those counter coattails. The Reagan coattails seem to be helping. For Mr. Carter, no help at all. So just to repeat, in Connecticut, it is Christopher Dodd over Jim Buckley. Let's go now to the gubernatorial desk and Max Robinson again.
Ted, we have a projection tonight in the state of West Virginia. The incumbent Democrat, John D. Rockefeller IV, J. Rockefeller, he's called across the state, is the projected winner in the state of West Virginia by a fairly comfortable margin over the former governor, Republican Governor Arch Moore. That was a bitter personal contest being waged there, with the former governor, Arch Moore, accusing Rockefeller of spending the mint in his campaign. As a matter of fact, it appears that Governor Rockefeller spent upwards of $10 million or more in that campaign, and there were bumper stickers, Arch Moore bumper stickers saying, make him spend it all, Arch, and counter Rockefeller stickers saying, spend it all, Jay, it's yours. Frank?
Well, it is his, and if he spent only $10 million, he didn't spend it all. Let's go up now to our resident guests here tonight, Tom Wicker of the New York Times, George Will, syndicated columnist, and moderator Robin McNeil. We're happy to have you with us, gentlemen, and we understand you want to talk about Ohio and a good many other interesting things tonight. Robin?
Thank you, Frank. Yes, I'd like to ask these gentlemen if they think Ohio and Florida are mortal wounds. Is there any way President Carter could still pull it together after losses, symbolic losses there?
Yes, it's very hard to see how he could do that, Robin. Ohio and Florida alone take 42 votes off of President Carter's total from 1976. If you add in the 9 of Kentucky, that's 51 votes off a total of 297. He's down to 246. Just precisely where he would recover those 51 votes is very hard to see. I think if those aren't, at this point, mortal wounds, they are as close to it as you can get.
You want to add to that, George?
Only this, that all the talk in the preceding weeks has been that would the Democrats go home to their party and put Carter over the top? There has been a going home, but it's not Democrats, it's the South, which in 1976 voted regional loyalty, not its ideological inclinations, but that's the sort of thing you do once. Not since 1960 has the Catholicism of a candidate been an issue. We settled that issue. A Catholic can be president. 1976, we settled the question of whether or not a Deep South president could be president. I'm reminded of a story that Mel Alphen, our bureau chief in Washington, tells about his mother, a Jewish woman in Brooklyn. In 1968, I believe it was, Tom, Arthur Goldberg was running for governor of New York, and he said to his mother, are you going to vote for Arthur Goldberg and have a Jewish governor? She said, no, we've had one. Meaning Governor Lehman. Once is enough. They made their point, now they've reverted to traditional voting.
Turning back to states like Ohio, how would you explain the inroads Governor Reagan is making into the union vote, into the Catholic vote, the traditional Democratic vote there?
Well, I think it's more than just pocketbook voting, although undoubtedly there's a great deal of that, people feeling that the economy is bad. I think a lot of that is social outlook. There's a kind of a social movement going here. People who are concerned about the state of morality in the country. I'm not talking now about the moral majority or anything of that sort, but I think that there is a kind of
it's more like the silent majority that Nixon used to refer to.
Yes, I think that's right. And I know that some of the Reagan people felt quite confident that Governor Reagan would be a very strong opponent for President Carter, because they felt that Governor Reagan could cut into the so-called born-again vote, the evangelical Christian vote. And that would be very important in Ohio, I think. It certainly was important in these southern states.
Several people have mentioned that in this exit poll of ABC, they've shown many people going to Reagan because of the hostage issue. Now, how would that cut for Reagan in your mind?
Well, I think it's a catalyst, because it does bring home the general symbol of American impotence abroad, which matches the sense of economic decline and cultural dissolution at home. For one full year of the Carter presidency has been dominated by this issue. 3 years of his policies, in my judgment, brought on the crisis in the hostages, and his policy since then has prolonged the crisis. Therefore, it is a proper catalyst, because it is a microcosm in a lot of people's judgment, including mine, of the failures of our foreign policy.
But a lot of people would argue with you on that. Symbolically, Mrs. Kennedy, whom we just heard interviewed, one of the leading hostage wives, who thinks that Carter has handled the thing well and with great sensitivity.
I think, yes, and I think, to take a little bit of issue with George, it may have been more important that the hostage issue coming up at the last minute as it did, but not resolving the hostage question, just simply reminded people of the fact that for 1 year these hostages have been there. It brought that back into people's consciousness in a way I think that it was not there, say, 2 weeks ago.
But again, I would use the word catalyst. This really brought together a lot of general anxieties. Robin, we've had 5 presidents in 20 years. We're going to have a 6th, I think, next January 20th at about noon. The reasons for these changes have been many. We've had assassination, we've had a war, we've had a crime wave in the White House. The reason Mr. Carter is on his way out, I believe, is simply put failure, a general sense that people are not well off. We have lowered our expectations for the presidency tremendously in recent years. We've not lowered them this far.
George will continue later. Frank?
Thank you very much, gentlemen. While you were discussing the issues there, we, as you may have noticed, indicated on the screen that the state of Oklahoma is going to give its 8 electoral college votes to Governor Ronald Reagan. Oklahoma was one of the 2 states in the South that went Republican in 1976, the other being Virginia. All the others went for President Carter, and Oklahoma is staying right in its Republican tradition, at least in terms of presidential voting. Let's have a look at our national election night map. Red for Reagan and blue for President Carter. As you see, President Carter has won 2 states plus the District of Columbia, Georgia, and West Virginia. And Governor Reagan has won 9 states: Kentucky, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Indiana, Kansas, Florida, Ohio, Oklahoma, Virginia. It is beginning to look like, well, the word is landslide. The word is landslide for Ronald Reagan tonight in this election 1980. Now let's go to Max Robinson. Max?
Well, Frank, speaking of landslides, in the state of Delaware, ABC News now projects the incumbent Republican Mayor Pierre Pete DuPont the winner, and it appears it will be a landslide over Bill Gordy, the House Minority Leader, who was actually the 3rd choice of the Republicans to run against DuPont, so powerful and popular is he. The other 2 backed out at the last minute. DuPont will become the first governor in almost a quarter of a century to succeed himself in the state of Delaware. He is also the one who is backed GOPAC to help local races for Republicans across the country. Frank?
A very important projection now, Max, and it's beginning to fall into a pattern. The state of Pennsylvania, with 27 electoral college votes, Reagan. Pennsylvania, the 3rd largest state in terms of electoral college votes, with 1% of the precincts reporting. We have enough information from our key precincts to award that state to the Reagan column. So Governor Reagan has won Ohio, he has won Pennsylvania, he's won New Jersey, and he has cracked the solid South that formerly was President Carter's. He's doing very well in the industrial Northeast. Ted?
And it's holding true also on the senatorial side. It was a battle between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh in the sense that Arlen Specter, the Republican, who was the district attorney in Philadelphia, has defeated his Democratic opponent, Pete Flaherty, who was the mayor of Pittsburgh. So it is beginning to look, as you say, like not only like a Reagan landslide, but possibly even a Republican landslide.
Very, very grim evening for the Carter forces. Well,
one more quick one, Frank. It's Mathias in Maryland. Mac Mathias, the Republican in Maryland, has just been projected as the winner. And that's the national election picture at 22 minutes past the hour.
This is continuing ABC News election night coverage. The 80 vote. Reporting once again from ABC News election headquarters in New York, Frank Reynolds and Ted Koppel.
Audio problems. I can tell you some of the results of our voter polling is indicating that the issue of unfair campaign tactics seems to have helped Governor Reagan quite a lot, and apparently also particularly in the state of Texas. ABC News is now able to project that Texas is going to go for Governor Reagan. Once again, Texas going into the Reagan column. That was a state that Jimmy Carter needed very badly. He needed to get the Hispanic vote there. We will analyze that shortly and see whether he did or not. Rather narrowly for Reagan, as you can see on the board, 55% compared to 42% for President Carter, 2% for John Anderson. Again, with only 2% of the vote in, ABC News is able to project that Texas will go to the Reagan column. We are also able to project that Maryland will go for Governor Reagan. There you see it, 51% to 39% Maryland for Governor Reagan, a new ABC News projection. Now back to Frank.
All right, thank you, Lynn, and thank you for filling in. Yes, Texas for Reagan by a relatively comfortable margin. Maryland for Reagan by a comfortable margin. That is a surprise. That's a total of 36 Electoral College votes. We are able to project a state for President Carter at this point. Massachusetts, with its 14 Electoral College votes, is going to be in the Carter column. He won Massachusetts in 1976. Despite the low total vote you see there, our key precincts indicate the president will win. The Anderson difference, if it was to be a difference, was expected to make itself felt in the state of Massachusetts, but John Anderson did not draw enough votes away there from the president. Now, the president has actually lost 6 states tonight, according to our projection, that he won in 1976. And here's the Electoral College scoreboard at this point. Ronald Reagan, with 270 needed, is now within 100 of victory. The president trailing badly with 35. Reagan 175, Carter 35, 270 needed. Ted?
Frank, we have a senatorial projection for North Carolina, where Robert Morgan has defeated his Republican challenger, John East. Here you have Morgan, who is going into his second term now in the Senate, with 7% of the precincts reporting in, 54 over 46. Robert Morgan was rated by the American Conservative Union as the most conservative senator in the U.S. Senate. So even though he had a very conservative challenger, someone who was apparently even to the right of him, John East, a political science professor, Morgan has been able to hold off that challenge.
Ted, here's the national vote totals at this point, with 7% of the more than 175,000 precincts scattered all around the country reporting. We show Ronald Reagan with 51%, President Carter with 44%, and John Anderson holding firm at 4%. The president, as we said, has now lost 6 states that he carried in 1976. And Barry Serafin, our correspondent who has covered Ronald Reagan throughout this long campaign, is standing by right now in the Reagan headquarters in Los Angeles, and we're going to go to him. Barry?
Well, Frank, the mood here is really one of confidence. Governor Reagan today has been cautious, as he always is. But through the afternoon, even before we started seeing these returns, some of his top advisors were saying, in effect, we've won it. They said, in fact, that the race was never as close as Gallup and Harris and other polls had shown at various times during the campaign. They insisted that it was always Ronald Reagan's to lose, that he was always ahead. And that's the kind of thing you take with a grain of salt during the heat of the campaign, but it's the kind of thing that now, given these kind of returns, you have to at least take a second listen to. Given the kind of projections that we're making tonight, they think it's over. They think they're going to win it. And they expect, when Ronald Reagan shows up in this ballroom tonight in this hotel, that he's going to come here to make a victory statement. Gentlemen?
Thank you very much. Barry, why didn't the pre-election polling detect this landslide? Well, there was a very big undecided vote, or at least a lot of people who said they were undecided and who were apparently unwilling to admit, many of them Democrats, that they were even thinking of departing from their traditional home and going to vote for the Republican candidate. ABC News has learned, by the way, that there is consultation underway at the White House right now to determine when the president will decide to go to the election headquarters there in Washington and concede the election to Ronald Reagan. Let's have a look at the national popular vote totals right now. With 7% in, it's Reagan 2 million, nearly almost 3 million, 51% to President Carter's 44%, and John Anderson with 4%. We'll have more on the 80 vote right after this. The solid South is falling apart as far as President Jimmy Carter's electoral hopes are concerned. ABC News is now able to project from the heart of Dixie, Alabama will go for Ronald Reagan. Alabama, with 9 electoral college votes, will go for Ronald Reagan. The unfamiliar face that you may see there in the third spot on our board is Ed Clark, the Libertarian Party candidate. He is finishing third there. John Anderson is not making a showing, at least at Alabama. So Alabama goes for Ronald Reagan, as have so many other southern states. Let's look at our national popular vote total, or here is the national election night map, really, with red for Reagan and blue for President Carter. President Carter has carried 3 states plus the District of Columbia. Ronald Reagan has carried 12 states. 12 states, including some big ones. With 270 votes required for election, Reagan is now moving close to the 200 mark with 184, and President Carter still with only 35. So it is, at this point, by all odds, a landslide for Ronald Reagan. We have not yet begun to hear from the states in the far west where Reagan's strength is expected to be very, very strong indeed. We want to go now to the Democratic headquarters in Washington and Sander Van Oker. Sandy?
Frank, you can use Pennsylvania, as we did in our report on the World News Tonight, as a metaphor for what has happened to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is no longer what it was. I resist phrases like end of an era. If you've seen one end of an era, you've seen them all. But it has come to a screeching halt. The basis for Democratic victories, white, blue-collar Catholic voters, blacks, Jews, that's gone. If you couple that with what's happened in the South tonight, again, that's a crack in the New Deal. Political eras run about 40 years in this country. In 1896, with McKinley and his genius of political manager, Mark Hanna, he got the Republicans to appeal with the workers with the full lunch pail slogan. And it lasted, even though there was an interruption in 1912 and 16, up until Franklin D. Roosevelt. From 32 on until 52, when Eisenhower won, the New Deal was basically in place. Now, you remember in Wisconsin, I said to you Ronald Reagan was going to run as a born-again New Dealer, and you laughed. In Indiana, I said, I'd like to see your face when they play Happy Days or here again at a Reagan rally. They did it in Dallas the other night. So what's happened is not that Ronald Reagan has buried the New Deal. He has merely stood it on its head and has begun a new political era in this country of differing coalitions. Now to James Wooten.
The Washington Hilton Ballroom, where the Republican National Committee has been celebrating rather moderately for a while, is that there's a sense of renaissance, a sense of anticipatory joy, that they have it in the bag, that Republicans are moving tonight as they haven't moved for a long time. These are Washington's faithful out here tonight, Washington's faithful Republicans, and it's been a long 8 years for them. Since Richard Nixon annihilated George McGovern in 1972, and then began the long slide toward his resignation. That included the indictment, the conviction, the imprisonment of several high-ranking Republican officials. In the off-year elections of 1974, the party seemed moribund. By 1976, the party was regaining a little bit of stature. Ford finished very, very close to Carter. Tonight, these people sense a real renaissance based on what they feel is a realignment of traditional Republican traditions. Frank?
Thank you, Jim. Barbara Walters at the moment is talking to Bob Strauss, the President Carter's campaign chairman. Wonder if we can eavesdrop. Barbara?
I think you can. Mr. Chairman, we are now on the air. Can you tell us why this happened? Why do you think?
Oh, I think, you know, I've been seeing political things for a long time, but I don't try to be as serious to what happened. But part of my judgment is that in our measurements show, Pat Caddell, who's been polling and tracking constantly, showed that after the debate we went down, and we went down for 3 or 4 days. On Friday night, his tracking showed that we picked up. And Saturday night, we had a good pickup. He and I met Sunday morning, and a couple others in my apartment, and we showed us about 2 points down. But I think the Iranian thing then reminded people of all of their frustrations. And my judgment is that from then on, we were tracking at every hour. We were going down. We're losing more and more and more. The fact that the president was handling it in a statesmanlike manner, the fact that he was keeping it out of the political arena, none of those things made any difference. This reminded people of all their frustrations of everything, and they just poured down on him. And I don't think there's anything that anyone could have done differently.
It's interesting because the Iranian situation was supposed to have helped the president, and it backfired and hurt him.
I didn't think it would hurt him ever, and I don't know anyone that, well, a lot of people thought it would. I didn't think it would, Barbara.
I have 2 questions to ask you. One, how is the president taking it? And 2, what is the future of the Democratic Party? Sander Van Oka seemed to feel that it was more than President Carter's defeat. It's the defeat of the party.
Oh, I think it was bigger than President Carter. I share that view, I think. I was with the president just about an hour and a half ago, and he doesn't feel good, but he's a man, and he handled it in the way I thought he would. As you know, I'm personally very fond of the president. He showed every bit of class you would want a president to show, and he said we're going to do everything we can. First thing he did was start instructing us what to do with respect to transition, so it would be orderly, and that shows class. As far as I'm concerned, I've been around a long time, Barbara. I broke my heart with Hubert Humphrey in '68. I'll win and lose some more before I get through, but the next few years I'll be trying to help this president that's coming in be a good president.
Is this the end of...
Needs, you know, we don't support our presidents very well in this country. I'm a fellow that's going to.
Is this
I'll support him as a Democrat with a lot of loyal opposition to it, but I'll still try to help him govern this nation properly.
Well, those are good words to hear. I know it's a difficult evening for you, and we thank you for being
here. Well, the people spoke out pretty clearly, and when they do that, the nation is better off for it. And I think Democrats and Republicans alike will do their best to see Ronald Reagan and George Bush have a good presidency.
Well, those are very fine words, and we thank you, Robert Strauss, for being on with us now, and we'll go back to Frank now. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Bob Strauss has been a joyful winner and a gracious loser. Well, now let's go. Go ahead, Ted.
No, I was just going to say, he's a classy fellow, is Bob Strauss.
Sure he is. Yes, indeed. And he's a lot of fun, too, and he knows how to roll with the punches. Well, he's had one tonight. We want to go now to a man who is even closer at this moment to the president than is Mr. Strauss, Sam Donaldson, who is on the White House lawn where he has kept his vigil for 4 years. Sam, what can you tell us?
Well, Frank, the president is getting ready to go to the Sheridan Park Hotel to concede the election to Ronald Reagan. He wants to get it over with. That's characteristic of Mr. Carter. You know, the engineer in him wants to get things done. This afternoon, for instance, after he had heard the bad news from his pollster, Pat Caddell, and knew he was going to lose, and he came back to the White House, he jogged, as you might expect he does every day. He jogged right here in the rain in the south lawn of the White House. Then he met with some of his senior staff. His friend Charles Curbo from Atlanta, the lawyer, his mentor, some have described Mr. Curbo as being, is with him, and of course his family. He wants to go to the hotel and concede. I'm told that he will make what is described as a gracious concession in the statement. There will be no bitterness in it. Last night, in one of his last campaign appearances, he referred to Ronald Reagan as a radical right-wing Republican, harsh terms, but there will be none of that in the statement. There will be no whining, if you will, but simply a concession statement of grace and a pledge to help Governor Reagan in the transition period, as Bob Strauss just told us, and a pledge to do everything he can to make that a smooth transition. And then Mr. Carter will go to Camp David, probably tomorrow. There's an off chance he'd go tonight, but at least in the next 24 hours, he'll go up there and start the decompression process from this defeat. He may take a longer vacation someplace else later in the month, but of course his plans are inexact at the moment. Because really, I think that he did not expect to lose until the last day or two when the polling results of his pollster, Pat Caddell, became so prominent. He thought he was going to win, so had made a lot of plans for what he would do when he lost. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Sam. Of course they don't plan on what they're going to do when they lose, because they don't expect to lose. And the polls really, you know, the headlines in today's papers all show that it's very, very close. Too close to call became words that everybody was talking about all the time. Jimmy Carter becomes the first Democratic president in the White House during economic difficulties. And perhaps that is why he will be the first elected president since Herbert Hoover to be removed from office after one term. We are making all our projections here on the basis of key precincts, returns that are being phoned into us from the League of Women Voters and then very conscientiously analyzed. Even though the popular vote total is still small throughout the country, we're getting significant data and enough of it from these key precincts to enable us to make these projections. However, during the day, we talk to people in order to find out why they voted the way they did, and that's called the exit polling process that we've carried on all through this election year. And Lynn Scher has some more interesting information on what we've learned today. Lynn?
Frank, earlier you projected Pennsylvania as a Reagan state. Let me tell you now a little bit more of why that happened. It's getting to sound like the same old story. The union vote and the blue-collar vote. Once again, Mr. Carter seems to have won it in Pennsylvania, but not by the big margins that he needed in order to carry that very important state. However, when we look at another very important vote in Pennsylvania, and that is the Catholic vote, the story is a little bit different. There, Mr. Carter got 46% of the Catholic vote. Mr. Reagan got 44%. That is a virtual tie, with John Anderson taking 8%. Again, look at that 46% number. In 1976, Mr. Carter got 60%. We'll finish with his Pennsylvania story in just a minute after you, Frank.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. Another state that is in many ways comparable to Pennsylvania, Michigan, is going to go for Ronald Reagan. It will be close, but ABC News projects on the basis of our key precincts that Michigan's 21 electoral college votes will go to Ronald Reagan. President Ford won Michigan in 1976, but he won it by a big margin because, of course, he was a Michigan boy. But now Ronald Reagan has carried Michigan, completing his, so far, sweep of the industrial states. Now we want to go to Washington and Britt Hume, who has more on some very important House races today. Britt?
Report on the results there. Our board, I believe, will show that the Democrats have won 83 seats, the Republicans 47, and there's a net gain there of 2. The most interesting of those 2 is the race involving House Majority Whip John Bradamus of Indiana. And it does appear now that Bradamus has succumbed to the Reagan landslide, which also knocked off his Senate colleague Birch Bayh. He now trails his opponent, John Heiler, the businessman, 27-year-old businessman from that area, 54 to 46%. And it appears that Mr. Bradamus, after 11 terms and a rather distinguished career in the House of Representatives, will be retired tonight. 70% of the vote now in there. And as I indicated earlier, we have about 130 of the 435 races in. It appears it'll be 83 Democrats, 47 Republicans, a net gain of 2 for the Republicans. Gentlemen?
Go on. Thank you, Brett. It certainly is going to be interesting to see the makeup of the new Congress. We've already had some surprising upsets in the Senate. Let's see the national vote totals right now, with 10% of the precincts in the country reporting in. It's Governor Reagan with 4,300,000 approximately, holding at 51% to 3,700,000 for President Carter. Here is George Bush, Ronald Reagan's running mate, arriving at his headquarters in Houston. Mrs. Bush just went by, and there is his mother, I believe, is also with him. George Bush, the man who fought Ronald Reagan the longest and the hardest throughout the long primary season, a man who was so disappointed we just projected Michigan. The night that he won Michigan, the big news was that Ronald Reagan had gone over the top in terms of capturing enough delegates to win the Republican nomination. Let's see if we can hear what he's saying.
All the results.
He apparently wanted to keep right on going inside, and he'll wait to make his statement later. The national vote totals, once again, it'd be interesting to look at it, with 10% in, 51% for Governor Reagan, and 43% for President Carter, with John Anderson holding at 5%.
You know, Frank, there's one observation I wanted to make about the race at this point. We are so deliberately cautious about the small number of votes that there are, not wanting to project Ronald Reagan as the winner of the presidential race.
Yes.
But it's been done. I mean, the president, we hear, is preparing his own concession statement, and it occurs to me that what we've got now is not just a landslide that was in the making, but a landslide. We've got to remember the polls are still open on the West Coast.
Yes.
Folks are just going to start voting like crazy, I think, for Reagan. And what we may have at the end of all of this is the biggest landslide we've seen in years.
We still have 2 hours for many of the polls to remain open in many parts of the country. That's the national election picture at 52 minutes after the hour. Ronald Reagan, the winner in Illinois. With only 1% of the precincts reporting in, nevertheless, our key precincts tell us that it's going to be Reagan in Illinois, and it's Reagan in South Dakota by a comfortable margin with only 4 electoral college votes. Nevertheless, that was anticipated. The big question there is whether it will affect the race for the Senate with George McGovern involved in a close struggle. And we have another projection from the Northeast, Connecticut for Reagan. Connecticut went for President Ford in 1976. Its 8 electoral college votes will wind up now in the Reagan camp.
Frank, I've got a senatorial projection in Illinois. In Illinois, where Adlai Stevenson resigned and decided not to run against. It is the Democrat Alan Dixon, who's been the Secretary of State since 1977, and he wins the Illinois senatorial race against Dave O'Neill, who's been the Lieutenant Governor there since 1977. So there, the seat that was vacated by Adlai Stevenson, now picked up by Alan Dixon. Frank?
We show now 243, I'm going to turn around here and look at it, 243 electoral college votes for Governor Reagan and 35 for President Carter, still holding firm. Well, of course, this brings up the question about a Reagan administration. We know who will be at the top of it. We don't know very much about the people who will be all around Governor Reagan to help him run the affairs of the country for the next 4 years. Our correspondent, Barry Seraphin, who has been following Governor Reagan and knows the Reagan staff and all his associates quite well, has this report.
Aides say there has been very little serious discussion yet about who might be asked to serve in a Reagan cabinet. Not surprisingly, the principal focus has been on winning the election first. So it's a guessing game at this point, but some of the informed guessing goes like this. Among the possible contenders for Secretary of State, former Treasury Secretary George Shultz, respected in the Reagan camp as a man with a natural air of authority. Former HEW Secretary and Budget Director Caspar Weinberger, a longtime Reagan associate. And Senator Henry Jackson of Washington, a Democrat but a hardliner toward the Soviet Union. Jackson is also seen as a possible defense secretary, as is another Democrat, Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia. Republican Senator Jake Garn of Utah, a longtime Reagan supporter, might be in the running, along with Texas Republican Governor William Clements, a former deputy defense secretary, and ex-NATO commander Alexander Haig. For Treasury Secretary Charles Walker, once a deputy secretary in that department, Alan Greenspan, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, plus William Simon and George Shultz, both of whom have held the job before. Caspar Weinberger's name is mentioned for Attorney General, and William French Smith, Reagan's personal lawyer and longtime friend. Reagan's current domestic policy advisor, Martin Anderson, can probably have that job in the White House if he wants it, but Richard Allen, Reagan's foreign policy advisor until a few days ago, when allegations appeared in the press that he once leaked White House information to land lucrative consulting contracts, is not likely to be back as National Security Advisor. A possible replacement, Brent Scowcroft, an ex-Kissinger deputy in the White House. Another familiar face throughout Reagan's campaign, Press Secretary Lynn Nofziger, is also not likely to carry on in that role. Nofziger has been emphatic in stating that he does not want that job, and while respected for his political experience, he's seen by some others around Reagan as too flip at times. The press secretary's job could go to James Brady, who has worked on issues and speeches during the campaign and used to be press secretary for John Connally. Look for public relations man and longtime Reagan aide Michael Deaver in some sort of role overseeing the press operation. Stepping into the job of White House Chief of Staff, Ed Meats, who had that title when Reagan was governor of California and again during this campaign. If not Meese, George Shultz or Caspar Weinberger might wind up in that slot. Anne Armstrong, a former ambassador to Great Britain, is also frequently touted as a choice for ambassador to the United Nations. Now, Now, again, we emphasize that's all guesswork, and we should also note that there are a lot of familiar faces there, but you could see some dark horses, some new faces in a Reagan administration. One of them, perhaps, Michigan Republican Congressman David Stockman, who helped Governor Reagan get ready for his debate with Jimmy Carter through mock debates in which he played the part of Jimmy Carter. As to a kitchen cabinet, those Reagan might consult outside the government, or at least outside the executive branch. If his lawyer, William French Smith, and longtime friend, is not appointed to an office, then he would be likely to be the new Charles Curbo. Ted?
Thank you very much, Barry. One particularly familiar Republican face from the past, Henry Kissinger, not mentioned by you, but you'll be seeing him with Barbara Walters and hearing from him when we return.
Election headquarters in New York. Frank Reynolds and Ted Koppel.
Let me re-emphasize again that even though ABC News has a great deal of information from the exit polling that it has been doing throughout the country and throughout the day, we are never projecting races until the polls in a particular region are closed. They are now closed in the state of Arkansas, and in Arkansas, we can project on the Senate race that Dale Bumpers, the incumbent, has defeated Bill Clark. Mr. Clark was, in fact, himself a Democrat, another one of these cases where the man changed parties just a few weeks before the race in an effort to pick up that particular race. But Dale Bumpers, the man who has knocked off some giants in the past, is perfectly capable of holding on to that seat, and he has done so by a wide margin. Let's now turn to Barbara Walters and her guest, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Barbara?
Thank you, Ted. Secretary Kissinger, if I may say this in front of you, had not been in the highest favor in the Ronald Reagan camp perhaps a year or so ago, even the time of the convention, but now is said to have a great deal of influence and be quite close to the governor. Was this a surprise to you, what seems to be a landslide?
Yes, that was a surprise to me.
Why?
Well, because, first of all, I have to make clear, I am not speaking for Governor Reagan, but I know many of the members of his entourage, and they led me to believe, and I think they believed until a few days ago, that they were narrowly ahead, they were confident of winning, but I did not have the impression that they were expecting a landslide.
You talked to Governor Reagan this morning?
I talked to him this morning.
Did he seem to feel that victory was going to be there? Did he say anything to you about it?
We didn't discuss it.
I'd love to know what you did discuss.
I just wished him good luck.
Dr. Kissinger, the big question, or one of the biggest questions, is what does an election of Ronald Reagan mean to the hostages? Not just these hostages now, but to should it ever happen again? It was a question that I asked at the debate and did not receive an answer.
Well, first of all, with respect to these hostages, I am confident that the election of Ronald Reagan will speed the release of the hostages.
Why?
Because the captors know that a president elected with such an overwhelming landslide on a program of a strong America and of a confident America would be much more difficult to deal with than what they have experienced in the last year. And so I firmly expect that this will be settled by Inauguration Day at the latest.
Now, what about a general policy? Does Ronald Reagan have a policy for negotiating or not negotiating with the terrorists?
Well, again, I don't speak for Governor Reagan. I think I know some of his general views. My own view on the matter, which I don't think is too far off, but my own view is this. One should never negotiate with hostages, with people who take hostages. Because once you begin negotiating, you have changed the issue from one of principle to one of price. Secondly, one should never go to international bodies unless one has an absolute assurance that some concrete, decisive action will be taken. Third, one has to put some time limit on whatever dealings there are, because the longer hostages are kept, the greater the investment of the people who have kept the hostages. And I would expect that there will be no hostages taken in a Reagan administration. I would also expect that if they are taken, it will be dealt with decisively and quickly.
Even if it might mean the lives of the hostages by not negotiating?
I believe that it is safer. When I was in office for 8 years, we always followed this policy. We never lost a hostage.
I must ask you about yourself, even though I don't expect you to announce tonight what your cabinet position might or might not be. But we just saw a report of the people around Ronald Reagan. There was some thought, or there were some rumors, that you might be made a roving ambassador to the Middle East, that you might even be made ambassador in charge of the hostages, should that situation still continue. What's your view of that?
I have never discussed any position with Governor Reagan or with any member of his staff. And my support for Governor Reagan has been because of my conviction of what was important for the national interest. Now, position of roving ambassador. I think that I could serve the country better by being available for general advice on the outside, by doing an occasional mission, if that is what President Reagan would want. But I do not really think that my talents are best suited for being a full-time roving ambassador.
You have said that you would not take a position where you didn't have negotiating power. Am I quoting you accurately?
Well, I think it is impossible when you have a Secretary of State who has to be responsible for the conduct of foreign policy and a security advisor to, on top of it, have an ambassador who has an enormous amount of latitude. And without that, you can't really conduct a negotiation.
Does that mean Secretary of State or nothing for him?
No, I have no ambitions for any position. And I do not expect any position. I have not ever discussed this, and I think that the list of people that Barry Serafin listed is outstanding. They would all do an extraordinary job in the positions for which they were mentioned.
Well, we thank you for being with us tonight on this, your first appearance in what looks like a landslide for Ronald Reagan, whom you have been supporting and whom you have been, as we understand, very close to these last few months. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Kissinger. I'm sure we'll be talking again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Dr. Kissinger. Ronald Reagan is now 27 Electoral College votes away from election as the next president of the United States. He has 243 Electoral College votes to 35 for President Carter. For more information now about some races for governor around the country, we go to Max Robinson. Max?
Frank, of those 13 governor's races, 4 have been projected at this hour, 2 Republican and 2 Democratic, and there haven't been any shifts in that power. In the state of Indiana, it's Lieutenant Governor, the Republican, Bob Orr. The projection in the state of North Carolina, it's the incumbent Democratic governor, James Hunt. In the state of West Virginia, it's the incumbent Democrat, Jay Rockefeller. And in Delaware, it's the incumbent Republican, Pierre Pete DuPont. So it's 2 apiece. We have 9 more governor races to go. And if you wonder why you're hearing about all the calls on the presidential race and not very much on the governors, there are a lot of horse races for those remaining 9. We'll be keeping tabs on them. Ted?
I didn't vote for me.
All right.
Thank you very much. If you want to join us, we're saying hello to Dr. Kissinger. Hello, Dr. Kissinger.
That's all right. That's all right. You don't have to duck away from a camera, Dr. Kissinger. History was made tonight. You did say you were surprised. Let's go now back to Washington and Sam Donaldson, who was with President Carter's pollster, Pat Caddell.
Yes, Pat Caddell is here with me. You were telling me that, as a matter of fact, you don't think it was that the Reagan-Carter images changed, but something else happened in this election. What?
Well, if you look at the results of the surveys we did a series of about 6 national surveys, really, before the debate and through Monday night. What you had is this situation. After the debate, the president went down about 5 points overall. The debate bump working for Governor Reagan, as most of the polls done Thursday and Friday showed. We did a major national sample Saturday night, and as we had seen in 1976, the debate bump tends to last about 72 hours. The president went back with Governor Reagan into about an even race. In fact, it was an even race, and moving back toward a situation as it existed prior to the debate. And we then surveyed Sunday night. In fact, the candidate attitudes, I should say, were showing very little change. The president had a slightly positive, favorable rating. On a personal basis, the governor is slightly negative again. On Sunday, what we saw was almost no change in the personal attitudes, but the governor took a 5-point lead over President Carter in the Sunday survey. By Monday night, that lead had gone from 5 to 10 points.
All right, if there was no change in the personal attitudes toward these 2 men, what was it?
Well, one of the major things that we saw changes in all had to do with related to the apparently to the hostages and to the events overseas. We saw that for the first time in 4 or 5 months, people's rating of the United States position in the world
declined 10 points between Saturday and Sunday and held that on Monday.
But the hostage news was essentially good news.
Yes, well,
unless you believe that the president was manipulating him.
That's right, and that's what we did not find. Interestingly enough, on two questions we had, one on the president's handling of the hostage situation, he enjoyed increasingly better ratings on Sunday and Monday, got up to 55-39 approval, disapproval. And on the other question on manipulation, two-thirds of the people consistently disagree.
We're going to have to wrap this up, Pat Caddell, but I appreciate you coming out and giving us the expation, because as I get it from you, essentially you're saying that hostage thing triggered a lot of frustration.
Well, yes, what it did, and you could see it in one major question, which is when people thought the hostages would be released. And what we saw there was that people thought it was going in the other direction.
And so it triggered the frustration. Thank you very much, Pat Caddell. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Sam. We do have another projection to make now in a governor's race here. And Max Robinson, you have that?
The projection to make, it is no surprise. Bill Clinton, the incumbent Democratic governor of Arkansas, is the projected winner in that state over Frank White, a savings and loan president who took a leave to run against Clinton. In fact, he changed his party affiliation. He was a Democrat. He became a Republican to run against Clinton. He wasn't given much chance at all to defeat Clinton, who happens to be the youngest governor in the United States at the age of 34 and a former Rhodes Scholar. Incidentally, Clinton was somewhat embarrassed in the primary when his opponent in the primary, a 77-year-old retired turkey farmer, got 31% of the vote. But that embarrassment, no doubt tonight, is forgotten. Right?
No doubt indeed, Max. Thank you. Let's look at the national vote totals right now as we stand at this point of the evening with 16% in. The precincts reporting in. It is Governor Reagan with 51%, President Carter with 43%. And look at John Anderson, who is holding firm at this point with 5%. That's kind of important, very important to him, because if he can hold it, pay back much of the money that he's borrowed to finance his campaign. In terms of the Electoral College votes, Ronald Reagan has won 27 states with 243 Electoral College votes, only 27 more needed, and President Carter has won 3 states plus the District of Columbia for a total of 35 Electoral College votes. And we are still heading toward the West, where the Reagan strength is expected to be very strong. We'll have more on the 80 vote right after this message. Another projection at this point, the state of Delaware, which went Democratic the last time, is going for Ronald Reagan. He picks up the 3 Electoral College votes there. That gives him a total of 246. So he is now only 24 away from cinching the election for the presidency of the United States. You may wonder why we haven't said out loud those words. Well, it's simply because there are still some polls open, and it's a firm rule at this network that we are not going to make that kind of a declaration while people still have the opportunity to vote. Also, it so happens there are several states where we consider the election too close to call at this point in those states, although there is no doubt in anybody's mind now that Ronald Reagan is going to be the next president of the United States. Well, that's the national election picture at 22 minutes after the hour. Ronald Reagan, the winner of North Dakota's 3 Electoral College votes. That puts Reagan 16 votes away from the 270 required for the Electoral College majority and the presidency. Now, James Wooten is standing by at Republican headquarters in Washington with Senator Howard Baker, the minority leader of the Senate. Go ahead, Jim.
Senator, a moment ago up on the stage, you said this is the most significant political event in this century. Why is that?
Well, I think this is the first time since maybe the middle 20s when the country has expressed such an overwhelming desire for a basic change in the policies of this nation. You know, electing Ronald Reagan by such an overwhelming margin as we're going to do tonight indicates to me that the country at large wants to change the basic way the government is run.
Why couldn't it mean that people just don't like Jimmy Carter and want to fire him?
It could mean that, but you know, Jimmy Carter's a decent man, and he's an honorable man, and he tried hard, and I think his failures, and there were many, cost him this election, but it didn't cost him a landslide. I think this is a clear statement that the country wants a fundamental change, and they want Ronald Reagan, and they trust him. They think he acted presidential, and they believe he gave credibility to the positions he's taken. So I think this is a watershed election. I think it is more important, by far more important, than the elections of the 50s and 60s. It remains to be seen if that prediction is carried out, but I believe it may be.
All right. Thank you, Senator. Cassie?
Yes, I'm up here listening to what you guys are talking about down there. Senator, there still is a couple of weeks left in the upcoming Senate session. Do you think anything will happen, or will the Republicans want to put a hold on everything now that you've got a Republican president coming in January?
The senator is having trouble with his earpiece. We've got Lionel Hampton in the background, and he's really singing, man. What Kathy asked was, are the Republicans now, I believe she asked, are the Republicans now with a Republican president going to do anything different now in the Senate?
Jesse, I think if that's your question, that you'll find if we have a very substantial improvement in our numbers in the Senate on the Republican side, and certainly if we gain control on the Republican side, that you'll see some basic changes in the way the Senate's run. I think you'll see fewer bills passed, but you'll see more general statements of policy instead of 1,000-page bills. I think you'll see the Senate become a policy-setting group instead of an aggregation of elected bureaucrats.
Cassie?
Yes, Jim, well, as I said earlier, there is still a Senate session to take place during the course of the rest of this year. And what will be interesting to see is whether or not the Senate Republicans allow anything at all to happen up here. They may pass a few kind of continuing resolutions on appropriations bills. There may be a continuing resolution on a budget committee bill. But these are the very things that Ronald Reagan made the heart of his campaign, cutting back on spending. So I think what you're going to see in the so-called lame duck session of the Congress, and especially in the Senate side, that you'll see a filibuster, and the Republicans really won't be letting very much of anything happen until the new Republican president takes over in January. Ted?
Thank you, Catherine. We're going to take a look now at the numbers, first of all. And if I hesitate, it's only because I'm not sure which numbers we're about to look at. As soon as I see them, we'll start reading them off. Well, it's on those 34 Senate races, and as you can see, there have been 9 Republican victories, 9 Democratic victories, 5 Republican victories. Thus far, a net gain of only 1 Republican seat. Let's take a look now at the names involved. Arlen Specter, the Republican former Attorney General from Philadelphia, has been projected by ABC News as the winner in Pennsylvania. And we've got Dixon, the Democrat in Illinois, John Glenn holding on to his seat in Ohio. We've got Dan Quayle taking it away from, that's the one Republican gain, taking it away from, hold on, fellas, I didn't get to the end of the list. Can we go back again? We can't go back. All right, Herman Talmadge in Georgia. We've got Russell Long, who didn't have a race today. We have a Republican victory, Mac Mathias in Maryland, and we have Wendell Ford in Kentucky and Christopher Dodd in Connecticut. Frank?
Ted, we have another projection to make, this one from a far western state. New Mexico's 4 electoral college votes will go to Ronald Reagan. There had been some doubt about this, because even though New Mexico is in the West, generally considered Reagan country, nevertheless, there is a very strong Hispanic population there. Ted Kennedy made an effort there, and a very major effort was underway by the Democrats to try to snatch New Mexico away as part of the overall attempt to lure Spanish-speaking Americans to the Carter camp. Let's see the Electoral Board totals right now. 270 needed, and you see that Ronald Reagan is 12 votes away. 12 votes away. President Carter still holding with his 35. John Anderson has none. 258. We'll look now, if we can, at the states that we believe are, well, the ones that have been projected for Governor Reagan and those for President Carter. The map is predominantly red, because red is the color for Reagan on our map. Here's the states that we believe are leaning toward Ronald Reagan. California with 45 electoral votes, Iowa with 8, Colorado with 7, Idaho with 4. I believe we have some more still to show. Well, that's it. But it doesn't take very many more for Reagan to actually go over the top. As we say, he is only 12 votes away right now, according to the ABC News projection. And to discuss these momentous events of this evening, we go back now to our resident guests here, and Robert McNeil. Robert?
Yes, Frank, we'd like to pick up on what Senator Baker just said, that the vote shows that the people want a basic change in the way the country is run. Tom Wicker, do you think that's what the American voters are saying today?
Well, I think it would be very hard to deny that in such a sweeping election as this. Clearly, they're endorsing the major themes of the Reagan campaign: less government interference, less government spending. But beyond that, I would be a little cautious myself in talking about really basic change in the way the government is run, because I think so much of that would depend on what the Reagan administration is able to do, what it tries to do, what will it get through Congress, and if basic change really means a change in some of the programs that are valuable to people who are now unemployed, for example, that sort of thing, I don't think the people are voting for that, no. I do think that it's easy to proclaim a sort of a sea change in American political life, but a great deal of that will depend on what this administration is able to do.
George Will, can a Reagan administration effect a basic change in the way the country's run?
Well, up to a point. It does.
Or is that just Baker rhetoric?
No, Baker makes a very acute point. There have been 3 earlier landslides in this century. In 1920, it was a call for normalcy. 1964, it was anti-Goldwater. In 1972, it was anti-McGovern. These were negative landslides. This is a positive landslide in the sense that...
This isn't a negative landslide?
I don't believe entirely. I believe that Robert Strauss was correct when he said this is not just people jumping on Jimmy Carter for his obvious manifold manifest failures. It also is a turning away from the Democratic Party. Because one of the reasons people have been willing to
just
turn...
a moment, George. The president is now arriving at the Sheraton Hotel in Washington, D.C., presumably to make a concession speech. A small patter of applause. We'll follow him through, but in the meantime, let's go on, George.
Well, as I was saying, what makes Governor Reagan, in contrast to the man on the screen, particularly interesting is that a Republican candidate has to put together an issues constituency, whereas a Democratic Party, having been in government so long, puts together an interest constituency. There are a lot of ideas behind the Reagan campaign, ideas about the Soviet Union, ideas about affirmative action, ideas about the level of taxation, and these ideas, it seems to me, have received a kind of mandate.
But in the... Excuse me.
I was just going to say there may be those ideas there, but there's an awful lot of frustration, too, behind that Reagan victory tonight. Frustration on the part of Americans, wanting things to change, wanting things to be better, but not necessarily endorsing some ideological, programmatic change. I would be very wary of saying that we are now going to see something as sweeping, let's say, as happened after 1932, which was not portended in that election.
Yeah, George?
Well, there's no question that when ABC...
Just a few seconds.
ABC won't name Reagan the winner, but it's been picking his cabinet tonight, and if you look at the cabinet ABC's been picking, it's an inclusive, mainstream Republican cabinet, different from Democrats, but they're not going to...
But not very different from the Nixon administration.
Well, they're not going to take down Washington brick by brick.
Exactly. That's...
We'll continue this later. Thank you, Frank.
Yes, thank you, Robert. And gentlemen, ABC News has learned, you saw the president arriving at the Washington Hotel a short while ago. ABC News has learned that the president phoned Governor Reagan about an hour and 10 minutes ago. He conceded the election to him, congratulated him, and offered to help in any way that he could during the transition. This will be an interesting time with President Carter still in office, still with all the power and, of course, all the responsibility for the conduct of the affairs of this nation between now and next January 20th, before Governor Reagan takes over. But he did call him about an hour and 5 minutes ago, according to our information, conceded, congratulated, and then offered to help in any way he could. The president making his way into the hotel now. It looks for all the world as though he's coming in to claim victory because of the applause and everything he's getting, but of course he's coming in to concede defeat. We'll have more on the 80 vote right after this. Well, we all thought it was going to be a long night, and it may yet be, but we thought it was going to be a long night in terms of finally coming to a decision, because that's, of course, was all the pre-election information, but turned out that almost from the very beginning, even before the polls closed in the first states this afternoon, on the basis of our exit polling, we had a pretty good idea that Governor Reagan was actually going to win this election. The national vote totals now are coming in at a pretty good rate, with nearly a quarter of the vote in. We see Governor Reagan with 51%, President Carter with 43%, and Congressman John Anderson with 5%. There really isn't all that much difference, a little less than 2 million in popular vote. But the big spread, of course, is in the Electoral College vote, because Reagan is winning state after state. He now has 258 to 35. And let's see the states now that Governor Governor Reagan has taken tonight, according to the ABC News projection. He's won Pennsylvania, he's won Illinois, Texas, Ohio, and Michigan. There's more coming. Florida, New Jersey, Indiana, Virginia, Maryland. Maryland was a surprise. Alabama, Kentucky, Connecticut, Oklahoma, and Kansas. None of those much of a surprise except for Connecticut. We still have one more vote board coming up, I believe, as our computer will... Nebraska, New Hampshire. Well, I did read them off. Here's North Dakota with, it's 3, the last to check in, so it's 258 Electoral College votes for Governor Reagan, putting him only 12 short of the 270 that he requires. He has won 8 states that were won by President Carter in 1976: Kentucky, Alabama, Florida, Ohio, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Texas. I may have missed some, but of the 9 major states with the largest Electoral College votes, 7 have been projected for Governor Reagan. Only New York and California still to come. The polls have been closed in New York for about 45 minutes. They still have time to vote in California, still have time to vote in quite a few states in the western part of the country. Now, with more information on what we learned today from our exit polling, here is Lynn Sher. Lynn?
Thank you, Frank. This may be a little jarring after those very nice pictures of Mr. Carter smiling and going into the hotel room in Washington and hearing Sam Donaldson talk about how graceful the president is being in what appears to be his loss. Because what we have learned from our voter polling is that an awful lot of voters thought that he had used unfair campaign tactics. Let's take a look at the boards, and we can see that when we asked the question, do you think unfair campaign tactics were part of this, 40% of the Carter voters thought so, 23% of the Reagan voters, 5% of Anderson. I beg your pardon, 40% thought Mr. Carter had used unfair campaign tactics, 23% thought Governor Reagan, and 5% John Anderson. And of that 40% who thought Mr. Carter had used unfair campaign tactics, they overwhelmingly voted for Ronald Reagan. So what we're seeing is a little bit of the evidence of what Barbara Walters was talking to the president about, the so-called name-calling. Apparently, it worked against him. Ted?
Okay, I think it's about time I did a little talking about my constituency, about which we may have to talk a great deal this evening, now that the presidential race seems to have been ended so quickly. It has not, of course, ended. You are still voting out there in the rest of the country, but President Carter has made his way over to Democratic headquarters for the night, where he is expected to make a concession speech. As Frank told you a moment ago, ABC has already learned that he called Governor Reagan and made his concession on the phone. But what's going to be happening now during the rest of the evening is that we will be paying very close attention to some of these key Senate races. And let me run off a couple of names for you. The first, of course, George McGovern in South Dakota. ABC News is now projecting that Senator McGovern has lost to Jim Abnor in South Dakota. McGovern was one of those. You see James Abnor's name up there right now. With 9% of the vote in South Dakota, ABC is projecting that Abnor is the winner over George McGovern, who, of course, has been one of the key figures in the U.S. Senate over the past many years, the presidential candidate in 1972. There are a number of other liberal Democratic senators whose seats may very well be in trouble tonight. First of all, what this now means is that 2 Republican seats, or 2 Democratic seats, have now gone over to the Republican side. If the Republicans can make a gain of about... If the Republicans can make a gain of 7 seats, or thereabouts, they could control the U.S. Senate. That is not out of the question. Frank, I understand you've got a call.
Yes, we'll do this very briefly, Ted. From the Deep South, South Carolina, with 8 Electoral College votes, is going for Governor Reagan. That may well be in part due to the influence of Strom Thurmond, who campaigned very heavily for him there. 54% to 43% for Governor Reagan, or for President Carter in South Carolina, another state of the Deep South that deserted the president on this election night 1980, a state that was with him very firmly in 1976. So Governor Reagan now is what? How many votes away? He is 4 votes away from the Electoral College majority of 270. He now has 266. The president is arriving now in the ballroom of the Washington Hotel, where the Democrats planned to have their big victory party tonight. We want to warn our affiliated stations all across the country right now. We are not going to cut away at this particular point in order to so that you might perform your very worthwhile service of bringing your viewers up to date on the local returns. But here is an incumbent president who has been defeated. He is about to make his concession statement and greet his supporters, and we think this is pretty important to stay right with him, so we're going to do that. Shaking hands with Benjamin Civiletti and with other members of the president's staff and cabinet. That's Bob Strauss leading the cheers. Go ahead, Ted.
Just quickly, before the president comes to the podium, ABC News projects that Thomas Eagleton will hold on to his seat. He was opposed by Gene McNary in Missouri. Tom Eagleton, the Democrat, has won.
Well, the band is playing Hail to the Chief. That's poignant, isn't it? Here is the president shaking hands with Hamilton Jordan. Behind him, Frank Moore, his chief congressional liaison. There's Zbigniew Brzezinski, and quite a few other familiar faces and names.
We have another projection, and I'm told this is by a landslide. Mark Andrews, the Republican candidate in North Dakota, has defeated Kent Johansson. If neither of those names sounds particularly familiar to you, let me point out that the senator used to be Milton Young, who was 82 years old, and he has retired. The new senator from North Dakota, Republican Mark Andrews.
Ted, here is one very important one, although not needed at this point. New York is going for Ronald Reagan. New York with 41 Electoral College votes. That does it. That puts him over. He is the president-elect according to ABC News projection.
Ladies,
and here is Bob Strauss.
Gentlemen, not only the president, but the splendid president of these United States.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt. The people of the United States have made their choice, and of course I accept that decision, but I have to admit not with the same enthusiasm that I accepted the decision 4 years ago. I might say I have a deep appreciation of the system, however, that lets people make the free choice about who will lead them for the next 4 years. About an hour ago, I called Governor Reagan in California, and I told him that I congratulated him for a fine victory. I look forward to working closely with him during the next few weeks. We'll have a very fine transition period. I told him I wanted the best one in history. And I then sent him this telegram, and I'll read it to you. It's now apparent that the American people have chosen you as the next president. I congratulate you and pledge to you our fullest support and cooperation in bringing about an orderly transition of government in the weeks ahead. My best wishes are with you and your family as you undertake the responsibilities that lie before you. And I signed it, Jimmy Carter. I have been blessed, as only a few people ever have, to help shape the destiny of this nation. In that effort, I've had your faithful support. In some ways, I've been the most fortunate of all presidents, because I've had the daily aid of a wise man and a good man at my side. In my judgment, the best vice president anybody ever had, Fitz Mandel. I've not achieved all I set out to do. Perhaps no one ever does. But we have faced the tough issues. We've stood for and we fought for and we have achieved some very important goals for our country. These efforts will not end with this administration. The effort must go on, nor will the progress that we have made be lost when we leave office. The great principles that have guided this nation since its very founding will continue to guide America through the challenges of the future. This has been a long and hard-fought campaign, as you well know. But we must now come together as a united and a unified people to solve the problems that are still before us, to meet the challenges of a new decade. And I urge all of you to join in with me in a sincere and fruitful effort to support my successor when he undertakes this great responsibility as president of the greatest nation on earth. Ours is a special country because our vast economic and military strength give us a special responsibility for seeking solutions to the problems that confront the world. But our influence will always be greater when we live up to those principles of freedom, of justice, of human rights for all people. God has been good to me, and God has been good to this country, and I'm truly thankful. I'm thankful for having been able to serve you in this capacity, thankful for the successes that we have had, thankful that to the end you were with me in every good thing that I tried to do. There's an old Yiddish proverb that I've often thought of in the days and months that I've held this office. It says simply, God gives burdens, also shoulders. In all the days and months when I have served you and served this country, you've readily given me your shoulders, your faith, and your prayers. No man could ask any more of his friends. I've wanted to serve as president because I love this country and because I love the people of this nation. Just one more. Finally, let me say that I am disappointed tonight, but I have not lost either love. Thank you very much.